Good evening and welcome to the District Planning Committee, 12th of March 2025. I'm Councillor Denise Gaines, Chairman of the District Planning Committee. Other members of the committee joining me this evening are Councillors Adrian Abbs, Phil Barnett, Nigel Foote, Paul Kander, Alan McCrow, Jeff Mays, Justin Pemberton, Tony Vickers and Howard Wilson. The following officers are also in attendance to advise and support the meeting. I have Mr. Simon Till, Development Control Team Leader, Mr. Michael Butler, who's the Principal Planning Officer, Ms. Nikki Thomas, who's our legal advisor this evening, Mr. Stephen Chard, who's the clerk, and Sam Chiverton, who is our Zoom host this evening. Before we start this evening's meeting, I would like to take the opportunity to remind members that we are subject to the Code of Conduct, which requires us to uphold certain standards, including, importantly, respect. Members across the chamber may not always agree with one another, but I would ask that in our disagreements, we endeavour to always be respectful of others' views. I would also like to ask that any members of the public attending this meeting refrain from approaching councillors unless you're invited to do so. We don't have any public in the building this evening, so that's kind of redundant. If a member of the public interrupts the proceedings of the meeting, then as a chairman of the meeting, I may, after a warning, order their removal from the meeting. If we hear the evacuation alarm this evening, we must leave the building immediately. Please proceed via the safe emergency exits en route, and please follow any instructions given by the officers. The assembly point is in the car park of the Dolphin Pub. If the lockdown alarm sounds, we'll remain seated and await instructions from officers. We will adjourn the meeting until such time as it's safe to proceed. Do members have any questions about the way in which this meeting will be conducted before we proceed? Okay. Mr. Chard, have we got any apologies for absence?
Yeah, we do, Chairman. Yes, apologies have been received from Councillor Richard Somner and Councillor Jeremy Cottam. Councillor Paul Kander is substituting for Councillor Somner.
Thank you. So now we're going to look at the minutes. Can I ask if anybody's got any amendments to the minutes? Councillor Williston.
Thank you, Chair. On item 31 on page 12, my comments were about the retail element, not the residential element.
Sorry, you did what? Sorry, like I'm looking at page 12.
I think it says something like 30.31 on page 12.
Oh, okay, sorry. What did you say?
I actually said it about retail, not residential.
Ah, resale. Can we have that? Okay, thank you. Anybody else got any comments for the minutes? No? Can I have a proposal for those minutes then, please? Thank you, Councillor Foote. Can I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Wilson. All those in favour? Thank you. So we can approve those. Oh, sorry, you're abstaining, Mr. Councillor. Yeah. Declarations of interest. Any members have a declaration of interest? Councillor Pemberton.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I was one of the members that sat on the Eastern Area Planning Committee last month, along with other members sat in the room this evening as well, where this application was initially considered. In fact, it was my proposal to refer it to tonight's District Planning Committee. I just wanted to let you know that although I obviously participated in the debate in that meeting, I didn't give any indication at all as to how I was planning to vote. So with your permission, I'd like to take part in tonight's proceedings and vote on this item as well.
And that goes for,
So thank you, councillor Pemberton. I was just going to say that any members that were in attendance at the Eastern Planning meeting, provided you are not predisposed and that you're going to consider all the evidence that you'll hear and all the information tonight, you are able to continue and vote on the matter.
councillor Barnett first, before.
Thank you, Chairman. I suppose I ought to declare for the last 55 years, I've worked either directly or indirectly for the nuclear industry. But I think I'm probably exempt from being affected because for the last 20 years, it's only been for the civil side and not the weapons side. Okay.
Thank you, councillor Barnett. Councillor Abbs.
Yeah, more a point of clarification, please, Chairman. Nikki said predisposed. Did she mean predetermined? Oh, thank you. Right.
Just to confirm, yes, predetermined.
Councillor Wilson, can you turn your...
Oh, was that so?
Are there any other declarations of interest? So now we're going to move on to item 4, which is the 24/02147 land at Strawberry Farm, Burfield Road, Aldermaston. For those of you who are new to this meeting, I'll briefly explain the procedures. Officers will present the application to the committee, after which the following groups might wish to make representations for a maximum of 5 minutes each: parish town representatives, objectors, supporters, the applicant or agent, and ward members. The committee members will have the opportunity to ask questions for clarification of the speakers. Members will then have the opportunity to ask questions of officers. The committee will then debate the item before determining the application. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Butler to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Chair. This application, for those of you who've done the site visit, is at land at Strawberry Farm, immediately to the south of the AWE and east of Aldermaston built-up area obviously in our district. The officer recommendation, the development manager be authorised to refuse planning permission. The reason it originally went to the eastern area, and this is in on page 25 of your agenda pack, was that Councillor Bowick, the ward member, called the application to committee because he considered it was unreasonable to reject the application principally on the AWE safety grounds. I know some of the Eastern area members will have heard this report before, but it's important for the Western area members to understand the detail of the report. And the location plan on the slideshow, if I can put it that way, indicates the location of the dwelling and the proposal. It is simply for a replacement of a dwelling which burnt down on the site on the 9th of January. Sorry, it became vacant on the 9th of January 2021 and was unfortunately burnt down. Apparently it was arson in its entirety on the 3rd of January 2022, about a year later. And the next day the fire brigade deemed it unsafe and it was accordingly demolished. However, the site has been subsequently sold at auction as a vacant site, and that owner and applicant is now submitting this application for the replacement dwelling. The new bungalow will be modest in scale, and you can see this here. You've got a photograph there of the original bungalow which burnt down. The new bungalow proposed is very similar. It's small, 2-bedroomed only. Obviously, single story goes without saying. The existing access onto the Burfield Road will be utilised as on the plan here, and there are to be 2 parking spaces, turning area, and a small residential curtilage. The red line there indicates the curtilage. The blue line does not indicate curtilage. It indicates paddocks, which will remain as is, but it's in the ownership of the applicant. Turning to page 29 of the EAPC agenda report, or the main agenda pack, in terms of consultations, I just highlight 3 strong objections from our emergency planning officer, the ONR and the AWE, all based on the fact that the site lies within the inner zone of the DEPZ which is the defined emergency, I think it's protection zone, I should know actually, sorry, for the AWE, where, just to clarify, the council has a statutory obligation to prepare the off-site emergency plan in case there's a disaster or an incident at the AWE. And as part of that OSEP, as we call it, any additional dwellings or accommodation, commercial buildings, whatever, that are permitted within the inner zone, are applied for in the inner zone, will normally be refused, because it essentially means there is an increase in the population density within that inner zone, and by definition will mean that it will be far harder to manage that off-site emergency plan the more people there are. So there are strong objections from those three public bodies. In terms of the overall appraisal on page 30, the principal issues are whether the application in principle anywhere is accepted, the tilted balance as per the NPPF of 2024, having regard to the proximity of the AWE site, which I've just been through, policy OVS 8 in the West Berkshire core strategy, character and appearance, drainage, and any other matters. Just to clarify, although we don't consider this site as greenfield, but it's brownfield because clearly it's been previously developed, we consider as officers that given it is outside the defined settlement boundary of Aldermaston, and the settlement boundary is Kestrel's Mead to the east, which is about 50 metres away on this plan, as you can see, the countryside policies automatically apply. So whilst we as an authority in the HSA DPD normally allow 1-for-1 replacements, in this case, given the property's been vacant for 4 years and there's been no physical dwelling on the site for 3 years, whilst the incorrect phrase in the officer report is abandoned, it should actually read meant the residential use has ceased. And therefore, we consider that in principle, the application does not apply with policy C1 in the HSA DPD. And that is set out in paragraph 6.4. However, we are now required to take into account the tilted balance, as you all know, because we have under a 5-year housing land supply. I think it's about 2.62 at the moment. That will presumably change with the local plan review adoption, assuming it is adopted. So the tilted balance in 11D of the NPPF is required to be applied. That is explained in paragraph 6.5. We consider that the policy objection of the DEPZ via policy CS8 is so fundamental that that overrides the tilted balance, and therefore the officer recommendation remains one of refusal. As I mentioned earlier, I keep coming back to the DEPZ issue. I'll make no apologies for that. I do mention in the EAPC report in paragraph 6.8 about possible precedent if this application were to be approved. I have to say, very pleasingly, since that report was written, and in fact, since I believe the DPC report was written, we have now had an appeal dismissal of the Brinton Common site. And one of the reasons they're related specifically to the DEPZ issue. And I'm pleased to say the inspector in his decision letter fully supported the council in its objection on that point. So that is an extremely up-to-date appeal decision supporting officers of the council in that refusal. There are one or two other issues which members will need to take into account, and that is character and appearance. And for those of you who didn't do the site visit, this is the area concerned. To the east and the north, this is to the east, this is Kestrel Mead, and to the north, this is to the north or northwest, there is significant built form. However, the application site is actually very open. However, having said that, given the proximity of the built form, one of the reasons for refusal were suggesting to you as officers, assuming you accept that recommendation, should not relate to character and appearance, because in terms of the visual harm caused by the new dwelling on site, if it were to be approved and built, we do not consider that to be so significant as to merit an additional reason for refusal. And that's set out in paragraph 6.10 of the report. And one further reason for refusal relates to drainage. That is more on the precautionary principle, because the applicant has failed to submit suitable drainage details to satisfy our SUDS officer. So if the application is refused and appealed, we then have a reason for refusal to ensure that if it were to be allowed on appeal, there would be suitable drainage achievable on the site. Before I come to the planning balance and conclusion, I'll just refer you to the update report for obvious reasons. I've mentioned already the appeal for the Gypsy and Traveller site at Brimpton Common, which has been dismissed. There was one small point following the committee site visit. I'm not sure, yeah, my cursor will work here. This area here, it was discovered by the agent when we pointed it out. He should have, don't know if he's listening, but he should have been aware of this. He is now. There is a legal right of way for a third party along this area here. So clearly the introduction of this parking space here would obstruct that legal right of way. And we said, if the application is approved, we need an amended block plan to show alternative parking. The agent has done that. However, it was submitted within 5 working days of this meeting, so we couldn't formally accept it. However, should the DPC resolve to approve the application, we ask the committee to delegate power back to officers to resolve this matter by the inclusion of a new plan, which you've already received, but I haven't shown you in the approved details. I've mentioned the timeline because there was a typographical error in the original EAPC report, and that's in the next paragraph of the update sheet. And just to clarify, the residential use of the land is therefore considered to have ceased after that date, and effectively in policy terms become greenfield by virtue of the residential dwelling being demolished, thereby extinguishing the use of the land. Therefore, Madam Chairman, the officer recommendation is a strong recommendation to refuse on the 3 reasons for refusal set out on the agenda report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Butler. We'll now go to the agent. Do we have Mr. Cottrell around? Super.
We do, Chair. We do, Chair. I'm just promoting him now.
Good evening. Have you got me? I've lost all sound. Can you guys hear me okay?
Can you hear us?
Ah, there we go. Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah. Brilliant.
Apologies, that was my fault. Okay, good evening.
Good evening. Good evening.
Welcome to the District Planning Committee. So you're the agent for this application. So you have 5 minutes for a submission. Would you like me to tell you after 4 minutes?
I have my timer, so I'm okay. Thank you.
Okay. Would you like to proceed then?
Brilliant. Thank you. So good evening, Chairman, members. This application, in truth, is actually going to come down to if you believe, let's say, that the bungalow's use has been abandoned or ceased in terms of the overall residential use. So the original bungalow was built in 1957 which for those of you who don't know, it's just 5 years after AWRE, as it was called back then, was actually formed. So it's been a long time. The bungalow became empty, as you've just heard, in January 21. The bungalow had been through the process of doing probate and the sales process in terms of when the current owners bought the property in early 22. At no point during probate or a sales process am I aware that a residential use would be considered to be ceased or abandoned in planning terms. At the beginning of 22, obviously the fire occurred. The dwelling was demolished, as you've just heard, by the fire service to the ground floor slab, as those of you who are on viewing panel will have seen. The applicant actually tried to pull out of the purchase at that point, but they were already legally bound, so they were unable to do so. Now, since the fire in 22, the applicant has actually had 3 planning applications. This is the 3rd application in trying to achieve that. The first one was in October 22. So when you look at the timeframes from January 21 to October 22, is that really a long enough time to consider that this use has actually been abandoned or ceased? I don't think that's fair and reasonable, and I believe that that's the wrong position for the officers to be in. I believe that really, in terms of the the clear intent from the applicant in terms of trying to achieve the planning approval over that period of time, shows their clear intent to rebuild the original bungalow and tidy up the site. Now, turning to the comments that have been received in regards to the emergency planning officer, they were received in November 24. The officer confirms that the existing building is not included within the off-site emergency plan as of this date, so November 24. This begs the question as to why they removed it and then proceeded to tell me that if the bungalow were to be allowed under this application, it would cause a significant harm to the off-site emergency plan. Why remove it in the first place? That's what I don't understand, and that's my premise of my whole argument here. So given that this application was validated in October 24, the existing building must have been still included in the emergency plan, and therefore the officers should have recognised this, and the recommendation should have been for approval as per point 1.3 in the officers' report there, where they have said that should if the C3 use had not been abandoned or ceased, then permission for a replacement dwelling would have been recommended favourably by officers, given the occupants of the theoretical dwelling would have already been accommodated in the off-site emergency plan. That's my point in terms of what I've said all the way through. I believe this bungalow was already included in the emergency plan and should be a replacement dwelling, which the officer has mentioned a few times. So just turning to the appeals that the officers are now including as a way of trying to bolster their reasoning, I suppose. The first one being the Gypsy and Traveller plot at Brimpton. Obviously, that is for new plots. That is new residential units. In my opinion, that is not relevant in terms of where we are. We are looking at a replacement dwelling, and that's the premise there. It's the same for the Sunnyside application that's been referred to in the report for Bearfield Common. And again, for me, that's a new dwelling within the DEPZ zone. More recently, or more relevantly, sorry, is the appeal at Red Lane, which is the one next to Tadley Rugby Club, which I mentioned previously. That was a bungalow that was built in 1956, demolished in 1992, and an application for a large house was refused on the grounds of the emergency planning in October 18. An appeal inspector allowed that one in 2019 on the grounds that the original bungalow could have been rebuilt under its fallback position. And I believe that is more relevant than the Gypsy and Traveller plot against this site. The officer also talked about the drainage, and obviously there's never been a flood issue here, so we would use the exact same soakaway systems. So to conclude, Chair, I feel given that the fact that the bungalow was already in the emergency plan, the fact that the appeal inspector has allowed the Red Lane application, the fact we have tilted balance that shows the lack of 5-year housing supply, this application should be approved accordingly, and I respectfully ask you to please approve this application. I do have one more point, Chair, which I know I'm over my 5 minutes, but I've received an email tonight at 6:10 saying that this application has now been called in by the Secretary of the State, which I don't understand where and how that's come from. Somebody could explain, that would be good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cottrell. So can you just stand by, see if anyone wants to actually ask you any questions? Do I have any questions from the floor? Councillor Abbs.
Yeah, probably ignorance more than anything else, Chairman. The agent mentioned 3 applications. Normally in the papers, I would see previous applications. I'm struggling to find it. So could I have some idea of what these 3 applications were, please? From the agent, because obviously I can get clarification from the offices in a bit. So.
Okay, Councillor Abbs. Mr. Cottrell, do you know what that, because in our papers, we've only got 1 application from refused in March 23.
Yeah. So there was an application that was actually submitted in October 22, which was for a replacement dwelling. It wasn't done by myself; it was done by a different agent. That application is the one that you're seeing that was refused. All right. I submitted this application exactly as this was. And that was withdrawn because the ward councillor had missed the dates to be able to call the application in. So I withdrew the application and resubmitted the current application that we have before us today.
Thank you.
Thank
That
you.
clarifies. Any other questions from the councillors? Councillor Pemberton.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Cottrell, you explained that the applicant was already bound to complete the sale by the time the building was demolished in early January 2022. What was the reason specifically that they were bound?
Yeah, so in terms of the purchase, so it's the purchasers that is the current owners. In terms of where they were at, because it went through an auction sale to buy the site, they'd actually submitted a very large amount of money to purchase the site. They were in for nearly 60, I think 65% in terms of the overall purchase price. And from a legal point of view, they would not have received that money back. It was tied in that they couldn't receive some of that money back. And ultimately, they decided that the best way forward was to proceed on the basis of, from a planning permission point of view, they believed that they would get the approval back for the current bungalow. So they were legally bound from that point of view to say that they couldn't pull out. They were in for a penny, in for a pound, if you like.
Does it answer your question? Thank you, Mr. Cottrell. Councillor Vickers.
Mr. Cottrell, very clear presentation. You talked about the property being under probate, and this may have been before your time as agent, but can you give us some idea of the timeline of when the probate ceased and the date at which the property was put on the market, and whether it was marketed as a property with residential use, and what the state of the property was at the time it was put on the market?
Yeah, so in terms of when the probate and everything that happened, I mean, like I say, that was before my time, so I don't know quite when the probate actually started. But obviously, most people will have been through that probate process. You know, it's a long drawn out process, isn't it, in terms of the time that it takes. Now, in terms of the actual sale of the property was there. The sales particulars have been submitted as part of the application. It was a property that was not, it wasn't, you couldn't move in, in day one, because it was very, very old. It hadn't had any work done. The windows were old aluminium windows. It was very run down, but it was a property that could have been refurbished. It was very, very complete. It was there. It had electric, water, and everything in between. So it was a property that had a lot of prospects, and that's why these types of properties, when they do come up for sale, they get snapped up quite quickly when there are 2 or 3 bedroom properties that still has permitted development rights, so people know they can extend under PD rights, and they have a little bit of land with them. I personally I would love to be able to buy a property like that, because I need a barn. I have old vintage lorries and I need somewhere to store them. You see, and so the property was very, very vacant, was very up together, and it, could have been refurbished.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Just the timing. Do you know when the actual property went on the market? Because I think that could be significant in terms of
I've got the, I will have the
the actual
sales
date,
particulars.
but was it well before the arson?
Oh, yes. Yeah. It was on the market for a long time before that.
Thank you.
Any other, councillor Kanda?
So just a point of clarification and a question also to Mr. Cottrell. My understanding of the way auctions work is that you pay a significant deposit on the hammer and you exchange contracts immediately. And then you have somewhere between 14 or 2 weeks and 6 weeks to complete. But you're bound by the contract. And it was within that period that the fire occurred, which was after the hammer fell and before completion, is my understanding. Is that correct?
That's my understanding as well in terms of the timeframes as to when things have happened and when all this has taken place. Yeah.
Thank you.
No further questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Cottrell.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Buick, are you available?
He's just rejoining, Chairman, as a panelist.
Good evening.
Good evening.
You know you have you have 5 minutes. Do you want to be told after 4, councillor?
I have nothing really to add to this. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions if they may help members.
Sorry, did you not read something out last time? Did you not have a statement last time?
I did, yes.
Hey, you don't have it at hand. It would be useful for people from the West.
I don't wish to make a statement. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have questions. So, Councillor Abbs.
Yeah, unfortunately, my understanding is that if nothing is said, we have nothing to ask questions against, and therefore we can't ask questions. It would have been really useful as a Western Area Planning member to have heard some statement, because now I have no possibility of asking the question.
Okay, I don't think we can ask any questions then. Thank you.
Unless I've misunderstood, of course.
No, you're absolutely right, Councillor Abbs. Oh, move on to questions for officers. Councillor Barnett first.
Well, in the absence of Paul Gollard, it's a transport matter. If we are able to answer it. If you look at the red line obviously doesn't go out as far as the road, and the vegetation is outside that red line. Now, one thing I definitely noticed going out of the site last week, it really obscured. Unless you go right onto the highway, you've got a job to see any vehicles coming along the road from the east. Is the entrance going to be widened? Is there a possibility of any of the vegetation being cleared at all?
My understanding is from the highways officer is that because if it were to be approved, it's a 1-for-1 replacement of same size, the actual permitted traffic generation will not increase at all by definition. And therefore, even if the access is substandard, which I don't think it actually is, it's not great, but it's not substandard. I'm not an expert. There's no locus for the highway authority to actually request by condition visibility display improvements. If there had been, let's say, for example, a development of 10 dwellings, for example, then clearly we would have required an improved access. But as it's just a replacement, that would be my understanding. He was satisfied with the access.
Councillor Abbs.
Thanks very much, Chairman. And just a couple of things. this all appears to be about timing. And so if this had come 12, 24, 36, 48 months ago, which I guess it could have done any one of those, would the officer's decision, when would the officer's decision have been the opposite to what it now is? In other words, I get that the building's not there anymore, but 24, 36 months ago it was, and therefore I assume we wouldn't even be, well, it wouldn't be here, would it?
Well, it's sort of how long is a piece of string, but the reason as case officer, and in fact the previous case officer under the 22 application, so that is 22-2599 refused on the 6th of March 23. I know for a fact the reason there was based on the DEPZ issue, so that was certainly 2 years ago. It's just that when we consult our emergency planning officer, who, let's not forget, is part of our council and part of the council's responsibility, plus the AWE and the ONR, they, even at that time, early 23, recommended refusal to the application on the DEPZ grounds. So I don't honestly think I can answer that question. Clearly, if the bungalow had still remained on site and capable of accommodation, it wouldn't have been removed from the OSEP. So let's say prior to, for the sake of argument, if we say prior to the 3rd of January 2022, a permission could have, in theory, been happily granted at that time.
May I ask just one supplementary to that? It's a slight variant on it. There are obviously lots of houses in this area that exist. Do any of them have the possibility to extend their premises? Add extensions with the normal rights that are associated with that, adding an extension?
Yeah, for a start, extensions can happen through permitted development rights anyway, so we don't have control over that. But the planning authority has taken the view, rightly or wrongly, as I understand it, well, presumably rightly, that increases in occupation through extensions could be controlled in relation to DPZ, but we elect not to. I mean, Simon Till, my manager, may wish to speak further on that, but we only control new dwellings because that's what's actually specifically mentioned in policy CS8.
Come in.
I can come in, but only really to reiterate what Michael's just said. The council's core strategy sets out the policy for dealing with applications in the emergency planning zone around AWE. And it sets out the policy in relation to new residential development. So that doesn't cover extensions and alterations. Now, it may be the case that if we were dealing with a replacement dwelling, we might apply conditions on the basis of restricting permitted development rights. But of course, there are many, many buildings that considerably predate policy CS 16. So those buildings retain or don't permitted development rights depending on the planning regime at the time. The current planning regime has some additional restriction that wasn't in place prior to 2012 to CS 16 being adopted by the council. And that is because the emergency planning situation, the population density and administration of the AWE's emergency plan up to date with the ONR and HSE's requirements has become a much more complex beast to manage. So the council took a position supported by the AWE and ONR in 2012 in respect of what development could be controlled and what couldn't, and it was new dwellings that was considered to be the line there. Thank you, Chairman.
May I just finish that off, please, Chairman? Because it's rather important to me to understand here. So if the extension rights exist and more people can move in, does the emergency plan have to update every time an extension is done then? Because I was kind of thinking that, all right, new development, then I'm forcing them to do an update, but it seems that it's got to be updated almost all the time anyway.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Abbs, actually, you're highlighting one of the tremendous difficulties that emergency planning have to overcome in administering a very complex planning area in terms of the emergency planning zone. And regular update of the emergency plan is part of the essential measures to do that. Now, clearly, it would be impracticable to try to update for every new building, but certainly on a sufficiently regular basis that the blue light services have a good idea of what they're responding to. There are complex arrangements in place for residential development for the businesses that operate in that area. It is a serious risk to human health. Thank you, Chairman.
Councillor Vickers.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm also interested in the timeline, but it's more the timeline related to the principle. And if I quote from the update sheet, where it says the residential use of the land is therefore considered to have ceased after that date being the date at which the fire brigade decided the structure was unsafe and therefore demolished it. And we've heard that the timeline for the sale clearly indicates that at the time the property was put on the market, a building existed which could, with a bit of work, have been, made habitable again. So what I'm concerned about is that it appears from the officer's report that had there not been arson, this would have been acceptable because there was clearly no intention to cease the permitted use as a residential property. So there's a danger that precedent that any property that's going through probate and then going through a sale by this method could be exposed to ceasing to have that residential use. So if this wasn't in the DEPZ and if there hadn't been arson, I think it's important to be clear what the officer recommendation would have been, even in the countryside, other things being equal, because I think otherwise there's a danger of a precedent. So why are officers really saying that this had ceased to be used, and when there's clear intention that the use would have continued? And intention is one of the conditions that you have to prove if the site has to be intended to be abandoned for it to be considered as abandoned.
Thank you, Councillor Vickers. Mr. Butler.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'll take that question, Councillor Vickers, because I think I've spent over the course of considering this case some considerable amount of time looking at definitions of abandonment and the distinction between an abandonment and the cessation of use, and looking at the NPPF and our own policies in respect of this. The situation is that abandonment has a technical legal definition that is set by precedent, and you're absolutely right, Councillor Vickers, that boils down to intentionality. If there is an intention demonstrable to continue a residential use of an abandoned dwelling, then that abandoned dwelling that derelict dwelling, let's go for derelict instead. That derelict dwelling is not considered to be abandoned. Cessation of use is different. Cessation of use is a little bit more of a grey area term in terms of how it is considered, and it's important to look at cessation of use in respect of the wording of the council's own policies. So a building that has been demolished has led to a cessation of the residential use of the site. There is no residential dwelling on the site, so that use has to be considered to be ceased. That is semantic but logical. Now, our policy C7 states that there is a presumption in favour of the replacement of an existing dwelling of permanent construction. A replacement dwelling will be provided that, and then it goes into the caveats for replacement dwelling. The supporting text to policy C7 states only proposals involving the replacement of existing permanent dwellings will be permitted under policy C7. So as this is the policy that we are applying, and going to your question of precedent, yes, we would be looking at this as a precedent for the entire district, because the current policy on replacement dwellings specifically states that the dwelling has to be existing and of permanent construction. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Can I ask a supplementary? Just following on from that, and it may be going beyond planning law, but I can envisage a consequence being that properties, as soon as the occupant whose life is under probate, whose estate is under probate, died, insurers might cease to cover the insurance of that property. Isn't that a danger? And are there precedents outside of this district that might actually help that situation? Because I think that would not be in the public interest, that every time a property became
that is
under
not
probate.
a question for this planning committee, Councillor Vickers. Councillor Wollaston. Thank you. Councillor McCrow.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First of all, I'd like you to confirm what I think, which is that the settlement boundary around Kestrelsmead and Falconfield actually runs down the western boundary of the site.
That's correct, yeah. Well, not, yeah, I see what you mean. No, it's separated. There's a, I need to have a look at the plan to remind myself, I'm afraid.
So perhaps I should have phrased the question as how close.
Let me just have a check, because I don't recall actually. No, there's a gap. So the red line, the cursor there, there's a gap between the red line and Kestrelsmead, the road is the settlement boundary. Yep. I don't know if the cursor shows. That's about 20 to 30 metres. So it's this area here.
I should have explained perhaps on the council's online map, there's a green area between Kestrelsmead and the site, which is a play area, I believe. And the online map shows the settlement boundary running between that play area and the site. So it does seem to be fairly close. But
I can check, but I'd have to look at the local plan maps.
Can I ask another question, Madam Chairman? If this site had been within the settlement boundary, would it then have been included in the evacuation plan, basically? But would they then assume that this site would have been built on and would have been occupied?
Yeah, my understanding is if it had been in the settlement boundary, then it would have been included because it would have been realised it is a potential site for an additional dwelling, but it is in the countryside, so that doesn't apply.
Thank you.
Councillor Foote.
Chair, that has answered my question. That was my question too. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor.
So I've got a few questions, and I was on the Eastern Area Planning, and with reference to Councillor Vickers' question that was then answered by Mr. Teal. In terms of the, and I've almost completely forgot what it was now. Yeah, the timing between, because we had this discussion last time at the APC, which is somebody, either probate or otherwise, doesn't really matter. Somebody could knock down their dwelling and rebuild to replace their dwelling. There could be a 1 day in between, and technically it could be classed as having been ceased to be a property anymore, and therefore people could be left with inability to build. And when asked whether there was a timing parameter, it was purely subjective. And that was one of the issues that we had, which was that this indeed could set a precedent whereby, because of no fault of other people and purely delays in terms of probate, fire happening, et cetera, that now this building is no longer able to be replaced. So is that still the case? Because I've not been satisfied with anything different so far.
Thank you, Chairman. I will take that question. The situation regarding a replacement dwelling is that planning permission is required for it. So assuming that planning permission was applied for while there was still a dwelling on the site, subsequently the dwelling, through, let's assume, vandalism, fire damage, etc., was rendered unsound and demolished. The situation at the time that the planning application was submitted would be considered the appropriate situation for consideration under policy. If somebody went ahead and demolished their building and then sought a replacement dwelling, this is actually a situation that occurs on a reasonably regular basis, resulting in planning enforcement action. And yes, the issue there would be that the dwelling had been demolished without the appropriate planning permission having been sought prior to demolition, and the use would have ceased. So in current policy terms, the dwelling would be contrary to policy as a replacement dwelling. And it's a case of, yes, timing, absolutely. And in this case, it's extremely unfortunate, and my sympathies lie with the applicant in terms of the timing of the arson. Unfortunately, the wording policy does not allow flexibility in those terms. It's very clear that there has to be an existing dwelling. And the planning legislation is very clear that the assessment needs to be on the basis of the situation on site at the time that the planning application was made.
So as a supplementary then, if no planning permission was done, people didn't knock down their house because they were planning to rebuild it, but it had fallen down, the lightning strike, whatever it may be, and like in this case, the fire brigade said it had to be pushed over and demolished, that then could effectively be ceased to be a dwelling, and therefore they may not be allowed to build it.
It could.
And that to me is a scary precedent. And I don't think that, you know, I find it a challenge that we as a council would really want to support that, frankly. One other supplementary, sorry, is in terms of the boundary and the lines, etc. The fact is there was a house there. I lived opposite that house. I was in number 2 Kestrel's Mead. Somebody had lived there for a long time. They were a bit of a hermit. Never really saw them. Kids used to muck around and what have you. It was clearly part of the village, part of everything. So to try and say now that it isn't part of the development, I understand lines and what have you, but notionally and from an implied term perspective, if you're talking contract terms, then it actually was part of it. And the fact it's no longer there because it burnt down is kind of subjective, in my view.
Want to answer that?
Thank you, Chairman. I think the points that you've raised there, Councillor Kander, were substantially for the debate. However, I will respond on behalf of your officers that settlement boundaries are frequently reviewed and they are considered against the pattern of settlement, the anticipation for the needs of future development, and as a wider planning policy exercise, if we consider that it's appropriate as a council that a site is incorporated into the settlement boundary, then that forms part of that settlement boundary review. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Councillor Foote.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. I have a question for the planning officers. Could I ask, if this committee, for example, did approve this application, are one of the concerns of the planning officers that this could then set a precedent for further developments, albeit fairly small ones, along that Reading Road sort of heading north? In other words, away from Kestrel Mead, but on the other side. What I'm trying to say is there a concern that were this to be approved, it would set a precedent that might prove difficult in the future?
Yeah, my professional view is that it wouldn't set such a precedent because to the east of the application site along the Reading Road, Berkshire Road, it is open countryside and very clearly outside settlement. It's clearly green field. I think it's extremely unlikely it would set a precedent.
Thanks for clarifying that. Thank you.
Councillor Pemberton.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So bearing in mind the sort of the challenges and complexities that Mr. Tull explained around managing the numbers and kind of the day-to-day DEPZ evacuation plan. This property was last occupied in the early part of 2021, yet it was included within the evacuation plan up until the latter part of 2024, despite the fact that the dwelling was knocked down nearly 3 years previously. Is that unusual for it to take so long for those numbers to be updated?
Well, I can't really speak for the emergency planning officer because clearly I'm not there, but I've had quite a lot of experience with other applications recently. And I know it's simply a matter of, well, partly workload, but the actual changes that occur over the whole of the DEPZ are very difficult to keep up with every single site, which is changing almost not every day, but certainly every month. So it's perhaps unfortunate it wasn't done earlier, but it's not unusual. I would say I would have asked our emergency planning officer to attend the meeting, but unfortunately she was on leave.
Are there any more questions? I'd like to ask a question about the statement that Mr. Cottrell made about the Secretary of State and Mr. Till.
Thank you, Chairman. Members, at 27 minutes past 3 this afternoon, the case officer received an email from the Planning Casework Unit stating that they had received a request for the Secretary of State to intervene in planning application 24/02147/full replacement of a fire damaged bungalow. The email does not state whether the intervention is in the case of an approval or a refusal at resolution, and therefore we can assume that at this time, no other advice having been given, that it's in either case. The Secretary of State has not disclosed a reason for that request to call in, not that we've been advised by the Planning Casework Unit. Therefore, I can't answer the query that Mr. Cottrell put. The case officer has spoken to the casework officer from the planning unit, and we have confirmed that it is an authentic request for the Secretary of State to call this application in for their consideration, and that shortly we will receive a formal confirmation of that. In that respect, members should be advised that under these circumstances, the local planning authority would not normally issue a decision until such a time as the Secretary of State had confirmed either their call-in or that they did not wish to call the application in. Members should also be advised that the potential were the local planning authority to go ahead and issue a decision without clarifying that situation would be for a party, including the Secretary of State, to go to judicial review on the basis of our decision. So members are invited to reach a resolution on the application as they would normally do and to debate the application as they would normally do, but are advised that it is not the intention of officers to proceed a decision on this application until the Secretary of State has confirmed whether they are calling in or not. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Till. We'll now go to debate. Councillor Abbs.
Yeah, thank you. I think that last piece of information makes the decision, which what I thought was going to be quite hard, quite easy, actually. So I started the meeting definitely thinking, well, it's only one building and what's all the fuss about? And then it's very clear from the report that the relevant bodies and the officers have put a great deal of time and energy checking that what they are saying is correct. And that carries a lot of weight with me. if I can find a hole, then I'm fairly well known for trying to find that hole, but I can't really find a hole in the argument. I may not think it's logical, I may not think it's common sense, but at the end of the day, it's very, very clear advice. And if it's very clear, very strong advice, I very rarely go against it. Now it turns out that if I make a decision one way or the other, it's not actually going to be a decision that gets implemented until we have further clarification from the Secretary of State anyway. So great, I can go along with officers' advice and they won't implement it unless it's implementable. So it actually becomes quite simple for me. Now, when we talk about auctions and things of that nature, there's always risk at an auction. And the type of auction would be interesting. I've been in auctions myself and bought things and actually not gone through with purchasing the property, because even though that meant me losing the deposit that I put down, which might be 3, 4, 5, it could be a percentage, but it might be a fixed sum. Depends on the actual type of auction it was. And we don't know what that auction type was, but that's a risk of buying property in this manner, in that way. So either way, it's not a planning concern anyway, not as far as I'm aware, unless somebody wants to correct me. It is just, unfortunately, a risk that somebody took and a series of events then overwrote and made it a bit more complex for them. Of course, I'm very sympathetic to anybody I find in that situation, and some of the bits of precedent that appear should be worked on, so there isn't those type of potential loopholes that things can fall into. But again, that's way beyond the grade of this district planning committee. So where am I in my debating? Unless someone says something else, I think I have to stick with officer recommendation at this point.
Thank you, Councillor Abbs. Councillor Vick.
Yeah, thank you. I also think it's good for the country, actually, that the Secretary of State is called in, because I think there is a need to have a bit more clarity about this issue. I don't think luck should be part of the planning system. It should be clear what you can and can't do, and it shouldn't depend upon an incident which is absolutely none of your fault. Because I think the danger is that if this was widely known, then it would be adding to the difficulty of dealing with an estate. There are innumerable properties going through probate, which I know can take years, and which you really then, until you've dealt through all the stressful issues that can arise in an estate, you can't really put on the market. And properties may well become uninhabitable or even structurally unsound. So I think we need clarity, but I do disagree with Councillor Abbs. I think I would have used common sense. In fact, I was talking to an officer at the North West Down today. We were discussing the announcement last night on the planning bill where members are going to not have a say in smaller applications like this. It's going to be taken out of our control, it says in the bill. And she said, well, actually, it's the common sense that members bring at a committee that is what we need. And we want you to retain the ability to decide these matters where perhaps the policy has got it wrong in a small way. So I think I would have gone with what I think to me is common sense, because if this, forget it's in the DEPZ, if this situation happens somewhere else, I think the law of unintended consequences relies. I mean, at the extreme end, you could have the countryside depopulated because of accidents that are happening to properties that had temporarily ceased to be occupied, but where there was no intention to give up that planning use. I think we've gone too far with our policy C7. I don't know whether it's going to be changed in the policy that in the new local plan, but I'd be inclined to support the applicant in this and go against officers' recommendations on this first ground. Now, moving on to the second ground, I think if it's so difficult to do an emergency, a DPZ emergency plan, you can't account for perhaps no more than 2 or 3 occupants in one house, and the plan is too difficult to implement, then, you know, there's something clearly wrong with the way that the DPZ emergency plans are constructed, because the difference this would make if it was rebuilt like for like, and we're looking at a like for like replacement, is minuscule compared with things that will happen and which you can do nothing about, like children being born or people dying. You know, and we've heard this property was vacant, but it was still included in the occupiable properties 3 years after it burnt down, or 2 years after it burnt down. So I'd be inclined to propose that we approve it, but I'll leave it for others to debate more. Had my say.
Councillor McCrow.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think the issue of probate is rather a red herring. And as far as somebody purchasing a property, there's always been the advice that you take when you exchange contracts, you become responsible, and when you buy something at auction, you exchange contracts. So it's unfortunate for the purchaser in this case, but you know the advice is insure it as soon as you buy it, as soon as you exchange contracts. However, on the other hand, this site is very, very, very close to the settlement boundary. I've had a little bit of dissension between myself and Mr. Butler, but according to the online map, it's coterminous. And to my way of thinking, when that site for Castlemead and Falcon Fields was allocated, the settlement boundary should have been drawn around this site, which at that time not only had this bungalow, but also a mobile home. And in the intervening years, when the settlement boundary has been reviewed, it should have been taken to include it. And if it had done, I think when it comes to the evacuation plan, DBZ, then that site would have been included. So I think there's quite a big anomaly there, which I think might be a reason why we might want to approve this application. Thank you.
Councillor Kanda.
Yes, so I tend to agree with my fellow councillors here on the left-hand side to a degree, well, almost in entirety. Having lived on Kestrel's Mead, as I said, it was always part of the community, and whether the line is 10 feet away from the boundary of theirs or not, it's clearly a well-established building that, or was a well-established building that had been there for some 50 years or what have you. In terms of the DPZ, I understand it's a difficult task. However, using that as what could end up being the sole reason for not accepting this, I find very challenging because, well, first of all, I had a 3-bedroom house there, but sometimes I had 5 kids there because I've got more than one, I've had more than one wife and more than one child, right? And also permitted development rights. I could quite easily have gone into my loft and added another 2 beds up there. And only last week, I was on a planning meeting where we've just agreed a multi-million-pound waste disposal and waste waste processing place, where, okay, they will have an on-site emergency plan, but that's hundreds of people, 24 hours a day. And it can just be accepted in the DPZ, and that's not a problem. But accepting basically 2 people maybe, or 3 people on a pre-existing building that happens to have been burnt down and then pushed down because the fire brigade said so, seems a little churlish from my perspective. So on that basis, and also on the basis of the precedent that if the Secretary of State is looking at that, and we don't know what they're looking at, but if the precedent that seems to be potentially there, which is, well, it's subjective, if it's down for 5 hours or down for 5 years, is kind of irrelevant whether or not it's a house, still worries me because shit happens, excuse my French. So from that perspective, I would also be inclined to not delay making a decision in the way that Councillor Abbs is suggesting, because if the Secretary, well, as in if the Secretary of State suddenly says, yep, go ahead with whatever is been decided and nothing's been decided here, and it's left to the officers, then it will go ahead and be refused. And I think it's too important to potentially leave it to fate. And actually, I would suggest we make a decision here tonight, if we can, even though it might not be carried out until such time as Secretary of State reviews what he needs to review. And I didn't mean to diss you, by the way, so if I have done, I apologise. That's it for me.
Just as a point of information, we do have to make a decision tonight.
If I may, Chairman, that I'm in no way said we weren't making a decision at any point this evening. I was simply saying we will make a decision, but actually it won't get implemented. It can't be implemented because the Secretary of State won't let it be implemented until they've made the position clear. So whether we approve or disapprove, it still doesn't actually go anywhere until the Secretary of State is clear.
Then I
Unless I've-
apologise. I misunderstood.
Councillor Pemberton, do you want to come back?
Yes, I'll jump in now, if that's okay, Chair. A lot of it's already been said. My inclination at the moment is to endorse the comments that have been made by the councillors sitting opposite me. I think earlier in the proceedings, someone mentioned, unintended consequences, and planning rules, laws, guidelines, whatever, can sometimes have unintended consequences because of the way that they are written, and the literal sense of kind of how they're drafted. Mr. Till was absolutely correct to talk about the intention behind policy C7, and I don't think anybody would dispute that if you want to replace a dwelling, there is a process to be followed. You submit a planning application, and that planning application is assessed in line with whatever the relevant planning rules are at the time. In this instance, if we're going to look at this fairly and reasonably, the applicant couldn't do that. They couldn't submit a planning application before the existing dwelling was demolished because they couldn't possibly have known that it was going to burn down. And I mean, it seems to me that the applicant at that time responded pretty quickly, having not expected the dwelling to burn down, in terms of dealing with what would presumably have been legal matters, matters of insurance, criminal matters, whatever those matters may be. And an application did come before this council later that year. It was refused. I understand it was refused, and I understand there was another stalling of proceedings when the second application wasn't called in by the ward member in time. But I don't see how we can penalise the applicant for not following the strict wording of policy C7 when, in the circumstances, it simply wasn't possible to do so. On the issue of the DEPZ, Councillor Kander has made the point. How many people live in each dwelling at any particular time? Who knows? We have a rough idea, but that figure will move around all the time as people come and go for a variety of different reasons. In terms of the evacuation plan, we're talking about one dwelling. How much of an impact is that going to have on the existing evacuation plan? I'm not an expert, but we are talking a relatively small number of people. So on that basis, I would be inclined to support this application and support the applicant.
Councillor Barnett.
I thought initially that this was going to be quite an easy one to actually determine, and I thought it was quite a straightforward case. But clearly, as we are getting more involved in getting more information, I feel that it's more difficult. And I've always gone along with a view that the officers and the professionals and the officers would give a certain amount of guidance, and I would try my hardest to take note and actually support their recommendation. Okay, yes, I might add that's probably the appropriate method to follow, especially in the view of being my position of chairman of Western Area. But having said that, I think also I quite often look outside the box and I look at other aspects as well. And I think Councillor Vickers has made the most constructive point tonight. Common sense. To me, common sense is something at the top of the list tonight that I probably take note of. And obviously, I've just listened to Councillor Pemberton and his interpretation of it as well. So, at the end of the day, I'm inclined to actually support going against officers' recommendation and actually supporting this application. So I don't know whether we're getting to the point, Chairman, of looking for a formal recommendation, but if nobody else is prepared to support that going against officers' recommendation and support the application, I'm more than willing to do so.
Thank you, Chairman. When I read the papers this afternoon, I was pretty convinced that the officer's recommendation was correct. But I have to say my views have been swayed by this debate, and in particular some of the points that have been made. So I think on balance, I'm probably going to also support this application.
So can I have a proposal?
I'm happy to propose it with the conditions that we already have in Appendix 4 to our agenda papers, which were prepared in anticipation by officers, I imagine.
What's your actual proposal, Councillor Vickers?
Propose that we go against officers' recommendations, and I absolutely respect them as having interpreted the policies as written correctly. But as I say, I think to apply common sense and see what happens at the Secretary of State level does make it a little bit easier, because we know it can't be implemented until that's happened. But I think it does need to be looked at national level. So that is my proposal, to go against officers' recommendations and support the applicant's application with the conditions that are prepared for us.
Okay, so I have a proposal to go against officers' recommendations. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor McCall. So a seconder, so I'm going to ask for a vote.
Could I just make a point? I think we need to make it clear that we're doing this on very unusual circumstances, given the location of the site very close to the settlement boundary, and also the unfortunate situation where the building was destroyed by fire.
Can I ask you to give me some words for that? Sorry.
Could we just get that back from the recording rather than me repeat it again? Sorry. Did you get that, Stephen?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so making clear that this is on exceptional circumstances, being close to settlement boundary. I missed, sorry, the second part that you said, Alan, sorry.
And the unusual circumstances involved that meant the previous dwelling was destroyed by fire.
I think, Chairman, it'll be in the minutes that the remarks that several of us have made about the emergency plan and the DPZ.
I appreciate that, Councillor, because
yeah.
when I want to say what we've agreed, I want to be able to say what we've agreed. Can we go to a vote now? So all those in favour of going against officers' recommendations and actually approving this planning application, please show now. Those against? I think that's carried. So that is a decision to go against officers' recommendations and approve the application. But I'd like to note that there's an exceptional circumstances in this particular case of just outside the town boundary, and that it's actually the previous dwelling was actually destroyed very soon, very near the time that the planning application went in. Yeah. Thank you. Then I can close the meeting.